Rejected Moon, Episode 12, What My Mother Knew, written by Mia. I read my mother's book through the night, In the Deepest Cave, by Mara's Failing Fire, and somewhere around the worst hour of it, I stopped being only myself and started being the last living end of a grief 300 years long. She had a beautiful hand, my mother. That was the first thing, the thing that undid me before the words did, that the woman I never had a face for had small, careful, looping letters, the hand of someone who'd loved the shapes of things, and she'd written to me, a daughter she knew she'd never watch grow, in a cipher that only my blood could open, so that her last words would wait in the dark however many years it took for me to be ready to need them. My darling, she'd written, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the thing you are hunting is your aunt. Her name was Lark. That was the next thing, and it took the floor of the cave out from under me, because Wren and Lark, two sisters named for birds in the old Moonborn way, and my mother had named me into the same tradition without ever telling me there'd been a Lark before me, an elder sister of her own, the brighter and the stronger of the two, the one everyone had said would carry the line. I had spent 19 years with no name worth saying, and it turned out I'd been carrying a dead woman's grief for a lost sister the whole time, folded into the only thing anyone ever gave me, which was a bird's name and no explanation. I had spent so long being no one's that the idea of being someone's, of being the second bird in a line of named sisters, of having a place in a story that began before me, was almost more than the grief. All my life I'd assumed the blankness where my family should be was a kind of nothing. No parents anyone would name, no people, no past, just an omega who'd appeared in gray water like weather. And here, in a dead woman's looping hand, was the truth that it had never been nothing at all. It had been a wound, kept deliberately clean of facts to keep me alive. Someone had loved me enough to give me no history, because a history would have gotten me killed. I had hated the emptiness my whole life. I had not understood, until that cave, that the emptiness was the shape of how hard I'd been loved, a silence built around me like a wall, by women who died building it, so the council's hunters would find no thread to pull. I was not no one. I was someone hidden so well that even I couldn't find me. There is a difference, and I learned it at 20, by a dying fire, 3 valleys, and a lifetime too late to thank anyone for it. She wrote it plainly, my mother, because she'd had no time to be gentle and too much love to lie. I'll tell it the way she told it. There were more of us, once. Not many. The Moonborn were never many, but a scattered handful of the moon's own blood, hidden in poor packs across the world the way she'd later hide me, kept secret, kept small. And 300 years ago, the Great Packs and the old order that became the Argent Council had grown afraid, the way the world is always afraid of a thing it can't rule, and they had done the math that frightened people always do, that a power you cannot wield and cannot kill, you must at least use. So they took Lark, the strongest Moonborn of her generation, my mother's brilliant elder sister, and they did not murder her, because they were not, they told themselves, murderers. They were builders. They had felt the thing already stirring far down under the world in those years. The true dark, the old enemy the Moonborn had always been the answer to, and they had decided that the way to hold it down forever was to make a wall of living power and bury it in the deep between the world and the dark. A keystone. A sacrifice that didn't have the decency to be a death. They cut Lark's bond to the moon, the thing that makes a wolf a soul and not a hunger, and they chained what was left of her into the deep places of the earth, conscious, aware, severed, to be the wall that held the dark down. They told her it was an honor. They told her she was saving the world. And then they left her there alone, in the dark, cut from the moon and from her sister and from everything that had ever made her a person for 300 years. My mother wrote that Lark went willingly. That was the detail she could not forgive, the one she pressed so hard into the page the cipher tore. They told my aunt the world would end without her, that she alone was strong enough to be the wall, that it was the highest thing a moonborn could do, and Lark, who was brave the way my mother said I was brave, who loved the world enough to die for it, had lifted her chin and walked down into the dark of her own free will, smiling, certain she was a hero. She'd been 19. The same age I was at the choosing. The same age I was now. And the last thing she said to her little sister before they sealed her and was, "Don't cry. It's an honor. I'll be holding the whole world up. Think of me when you look at the moon." Then they cut her bond and walked away and let the honor rot her into a horror over 3 slow centuries, and my mother had thought of her every single time she looked at the moon, exactly as she'd been asked to, for the rest of her short, hunted life. And a moonborn cut from the moon and left alone long enough does not stay a wall. It hollows. It forgets it was ever anything but the dark it was set to hold. And somewhere in those 3 centuries, my Aunt Lark stopped being the keystone the founders made and became indistinguishable from the thing she'd been buried to contain, until the wall and the dark behind it were one hungry, severed thing, and the only difference between the severed and the enemy it once held back was that the severed remembered, in some ruined cellar of itself, that it had a sister and a name, and had once been loved, and had been thrown into the dark anyway. My mother had been a child when they took Lark. She'd watched the Order do it. She'd spent her whole life since carrying the one truth the Council killed to bury, that the thing under the world wasn't a separate evil at all. It was the Founders' own atrocity, still conscious, still grieving, gone slowly insane in the dark they sealed it in, and the Argent Council's 200 years of hunting the Moonborn had never been about the bell waking the dark. It had been about keeping anyone alive who might find out what the Council's own grandfathers had done. The hunting wasn't offense. It was evidence burning. My whole bloodline had been murdered for 3 centuries to keep a secret. "You knew," I said to Mara, when I could speak. The fire had burned low. My face was wet, and I hadn't noticed. All of it. The wall, the cutting, what they did to Lark. I knew. Her voice was very thin now. The night had been taking her even as it gave me my mother. I'm the last of the Order that broke when your mother's mother learned the truth and turned against it. We've kept it 300 years, the real story, passed blood to blood, waiting for a moonborn strong enough and angry enough to do the thing your mother couldn't. Her ruined hand found mine. Read the last of it, child. The how. She worked it out at the end. Your mother, lying awake the way you're lying awake now. Read it, and then I can stop. I've been so tired for so long. I looked at her, really looked the way she taught me for the thing under the thing. 300 years her Order had carried this. Generations of them, passing the truth blood to blood, hunted the whole time, dying with it sealed in their mouths, on the gamble that one day a moonborn would be born angry enough and loved enough and late enough to do something with it. Mara had spent her own life on that gamble. She'd carried an infant 3 valleys through pink snow. She'd hidden me in a laundry and watched me be nothing for 19 years and never once told me, because telling me was the one thing that could get me killed before I was ready. You let me be miserable, I said, not as an accusation, just as a true thing that needed saying once. On purpose, to keep me alive. Yes, Mara said, without flinching. And I do it again, every gray day of it, to have you here now, strong enough to read that book and not break. Misery kept you small, and small kept you breathing, and breathing got you to this fire. I'm not sorry, child. Be angry if you need to, but I'm not sorry. So I read the last pages, the how, the thing my mother died before she could do, and I understood at last why the wisest wolves in the world had called the severed unkillable, and why they'd been wrong, and why being right was going to be so much worse. You cannot kill it, my mother wrote. Light won't end it. It is light gone wrong. Force won't end it. It is the strongest of us, and 300 years of hunger besides. There is only one thing in all the world that can reach a severed, my darling, and it is the one thing they cut away from her, and it is the reason I am writing this in a cipher and hiding it in your blood instead of doing it myself, because I am too afraid, and you may be braver than your mother was. The bond. You have to bond to it. Open your own thread to your aunt the way the right once opened a champion to a keystone. Let her in, all the way, the severed and the whole, and give her back across the bond the things she was denied for 300 years. Not a wall, not a weapon, a sister. You have to go down into the dark where they chained Lark, and you have to ring the bell until she comes, and you have to open your own soul to the hungriest thing in the world and offer it love instead of light. And either you will give her enough of the moon back, through the bond, to let her finally die as herself, released and whole and free, or she will pour 300 years of severed hunger up your open thread and into you, and there will be 2 severed where there was 1, and the second will be you. I could not make myself do it. I have stood at the edge of the deep a dozen times and turned back, because I am not brave enough to open my heart to my own ruined sister, knowing she might eat it. So I made you instead, not to be a weapon, my darling, never that. I made you in the desperate hope that the moon would pour itself into someone with more courage than her mother, and a harder life, and less to lose. I am so sorry. It is a terrible thing to make a child to do the thing you cannot. Forgive me or don't, but know that I loved you before you existed, fiercely, the way I still love the sister I could not save. Go and give your aunt the death the world denied her. And try, my brave girl, my Wren, try not to become her doing it. I closed the book. The fire had gone to embers. Mara was watching me with eyes that had finally run out of fear, and I understood she'd been holding on for exactly this, to see the book pass and the truth land and her 300-year watch finally end, and I held her dry hand and did not tell her not to go, because that would have been a cruelty, and I was done with cruelty dressed as kindness. Her name was Lark. I said to Mara because someone should say it, because no one had said it kindly in 300 years. My aunt. She was the brightest of her line, and they buried her alive in the dark and told her it was an honor, and I'm going to go down there and call her by her name and either save her or die as her, and either way she is going to hear, before the end, one voice that remembers she was a person. Mara smiled. It was the last thing she did. She smiled, and her hand went slack in mine, and the last of the old order that had carried my bloodline's secret through 3 centuries of snow let go of it at last, into the only pair of hands left to hold it. I sat with her a while. There was no one to call. The scattered pack had their own dead to grieve and no love spare for the mad old woman who'd been kind to the thing they blamed for everything. So I closed Mara's eyes myself, the way I'd closed 40 villagers in Harrowmere, and I did for her the only right I had strength left for, which was to say her name aloud into the dark and tell it she had not failed. You carried it the whole way. I told the body of the woman who'd carried me. 300 years, and it came down to you, and you didn't drop it. You handed it to the one person who could use it. That's not failing, Mara. That's the bravest thing anyone in this whole sorry story ever did, and nobody's going to sing it. So, I'm telling you now, while you can maybe still hear, it worked. Rest. Ronan found me there in the cold and did not say anything, and Kale found me there and did not say anything, and the two of them sat down on either side of me in the dark beside the woman who'd saved my life, and for once neither of them was a king or an alpha or a man who wanted me. They were just two people keeping a third company beside a fourth who was gone. It was, I think, the kindest hour any of us spent in the whole war. And outside the cave, in the high cold dark, the bell I had been holding quiet all night trembled, because I had read the dark's true name and understood it, and grief that large does not go unfelt by the thing that is made of it. Far down under the world, my Aunt Lark lifted her ruined head and turned, for the first time in 300 years, toward a voice that knew her, and at the edge of the scattered pack's hidden fold, in the snow, the first of the risen appeared, walking slow and patient out of the white, coming not to kill us now. Coming to carry me home to her. To be continued. That was episode 12 of Rejected Moon. If the moon has you now, the next episode is waiting. Subscribe so you don't lose the trail. The complete book is available on Amazon, and early episodes and bonus chapters are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
I'm Mia.
Thank you for listening.